and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us tonight on the annual Edith Mary Gayton lecture. Just some housekeeping, and then I will invite Simon, the head of school, to do the proper introduction to the session. First things first, there's no fire drill, but if the alarm goes off, we can use the door over here, and then the assembly point is on the grass in the middle between the buildings, our building and the psychology building. If we use that fire exit, then we have the option either on the right hand side to the parking area or on the left hand side, which again will lead us to the grass area between the buildings. Second and most important for the smooth session, I will ask you to please mute your, put on silent your mobile phones, so we have no interaction. And I would also like to welcome the people that have joined us online, and to mention that there will be the Q&A panel on the top, where they can actually post the questions, which I will manage, and I will also address during the Q&A session. Simon, please join us.
Welcome everybody. It's good to see a packed room and to see we've bounced back after pandemic restrictions. It's been a while since I've seen this lecture theatre so full. I'm just going to spend a few moments welcoming you and introducing the school before I introduce our guest speaker this evening, and I'm going to do that in the form of numbers. We've been teaching agriculture and related subjects at Reading now for 131 years. Back in the 1890s, we were established at a site down in the town centre. Wonderful photo here of a special poultry class from the 1890s. I think dress has changed slightly since those times, and in fact even this evening I've been picked up for not wearing a tie, but times have changed. We're a community of about 1,000 here. We have currently on the roll 823 students, and one of the amazing things about our school community here is that those students are drawn from 80 countries across the world, so we truly are a global community. Those students interact with currently 187 staff. We're arranged into 5 departments. So we range from crop and animal science through 2 departments that look at the environmental and the social consequences of human activities such as farming, in international development and sustainable land management. And then finally we have a large department in agri-food economics and marketing. Last year we published 204 peer-reviewed research articles, and our research output is very impactful. The school currently has a budget of 16 million, and about half of that is research income and about half teaching income. But not only are we an academic school here on the White Knights campus, but we also manage 2 farms on the edge of Reading. So we're currently farming about 630 hectares to the east and the south of the town. Our main business is dairy farming, and last year we produced 5.8 million litres of milk. One thing we're immensely proud of at Reading is the way that our research impact and our teaching and the STEAM rank us in the global subject rankings for agricultural universities, and currently we're ranked 11th in the world for teaching and research in agriculture and forestry. So that's something that reflects not only our research strengths but also our strengths in teaching and the standing of our alumni who have gone out across the world and are involved in agri-food industries across the world. And finally, this is the 40th anniversary of the first of our Edith Mary Gayton lectures. The first one back in 1984 was delivered by Professor John Nix, and we've had a very wide range of eminent speakers delivering our annual addresses since that date. The event has been organised by the school's farm management unit, and that unit exists to coordinate research across our departments in areas related to farm management. It provides a focus for our outreach activities and also supports a number of activities, not least of which is tonight's lecture, but we also fund PhD students for research in farm management. And recently we've been doing a lot of work around developing and modernising our teaching curriculum, ready for a launch in 2024. The Edith Mary Gayton lecture is supported by a fund in honour of Edith Mary Gayton. Edith was a student in the Department of Agriculture during the interwar period, and her husband made a bequest to the university in her memory, and the farm management unit have been managing the funds, and the principal activity is these annual lectures on subjects relating to farm management. And so it gives me great honour tonight to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Minette Batters, President of the National Farmers Union. Minette, as I'm sure many of you know, runs a family farm in Wiltshire with a suckler herd and sheep and arable enterprises, plus some diversification activities around running an events venue. Minette served as Deputy President of the NFU for 4 years, from 2014 to 2018, before being elected President in February 2018. And one of the significant activities during her time in office has been to lead a very successful petition which brought together chefs, farmers, environmentalists, animal rights experts and so on, resulting in 1 million people signing a food standards petition that the NFU organised. The last 5 to 7 years have been a time of immense change, and I'm sure back in 2018 when Minette took office, she wasn't quite expecting what she's had to deal with. I think we knew it was going to be complicated with Brexit. If you add into the mix pandemics, war in different parts of the world, and the resulting energy crisis, it was going to be a tough time. And we've given you a very tough title tonight, Minette, to deal with. So tonight's lecture is entitled Farm Management and Policy Approaches to Support the Journey from Net Zero Farming Without Compromising Food Security and Quality. I feel like we've asked you to deliver the Holy Grail tonight, Minette, and I'm really looking forward to what you've got to tell us. So let me hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and what a huge privilege it is to be here, and I guess not only with the subject title of tonight, but the varied audience too. So trying to be relevant to the students, how shall I put this, as well as the people of my generation. I will try and make it as relevant as I can. And I guess I want to, before I get on to actually what net zero policy looks like for us and what the thinking looks like, I want to sort of set the scene on the extraordinary events, really, of my time as president of the NFU, the last of which, sadly, the war in Ukraine, is a sort of game changer and actually makes delivering on net zero ever more critical, because we have to achieve so much more and so much less. And it really has put into sharp focus, I think, the challenges not only on energy security as well as food security. And alongside all of that, I have worked with 4 different prime ministers, quite hard to believe. And they have been 4 completely different prime ministers. I mean, they really could have been different parties, because they've had completely different approaches. So it was, you know, back in the day with Theresa May. It was the 27th of June 2019, and really this was her revenge tactic, I think, on Boris Johnson as she left office, to say, right, you are going to deliver net zero, we are going to legislate for it by 2050, and basically all UK emissions must be at zero by 2050. quite a massive, massive challenge. So that was on the 27th of June. At the time, of course, not only have we worked with, or I worked with 4 prime ministers, I've also worked with quite a lot of secretaries of state, which have also been extremely different in DEFRA as well. So back in 2019, we were working with Michael Gove. New in, didn't like unions. Anybody who's a teacher, I'm sure well known to the university, he wasn't particularly popular. He's a disruptor. So he didn't like unions, he didn't like trade associations, he's a big tent operator and he's a disruptor. And at the time, of course, he was being punished by being put into DEFRA, which effectively he used quite brilliantly to rebrand Michael Gove. But there were a couple of things for us. One, agriculture was locked out of the room. Agriculture was deemed the problem as far as emissions go, not the solution. So we were locked out of the room. And we also wanted to get Michael Gove focusing on food production rather than just delivering for the environment. So we decided, and it takes, sadly, I can't just say what I want to say when I want to say it. We are democratic, and so I have to get the permission. I chair our policy board, which has all sectors, all land areas represented on it, and I have to get permission to make big announcements. Things like in 2019 saying agriculture could beat the government target by 10 years to achieve net zero. And it's fair to say, when I first mentioned those words, everybody's mouths opened and dropped. And there was sort of, why on earth would you say that? Well, we were locked out of the room. We wanted to open the doors. And we wanted to, what I crudely called, give Michael Gove a magpie moment. Ideally think that agriculture was this shiny jewel that he'd want to know more about. So that was the decision. And it was at the Oxford Farming Conference in 2019 that we said, and we were one of the first to say it, and actually I was with Miles Allen, who will be known to many of you at the Oxford Martin University in Oxford today, and he said it was groundbreaking, actually. You were one of the first that actually came out and said we can achieve this. And I remember sitting back down next to Michael Gove and saying, what do you think? And he said, oh, you know how his oval eyes sort of flap up and down. And he said, well, I think you are very, very brave. And anyway, a week later, he phoned me up and he said, I've made a new appointment for the chair of Natural England. And he said, I'm a bit worried as to what you might think. And I said, well, who is it? And he said, well, it's Tony Juniper. And I said, well, Michael, I think you are very brave. But anyway, he's, to which he laughed. Anyway, Tony is on his second term now and enjoying the job. And I am with him, indeed, on farm in Leicestershire, because it's really important that we work collaboratively together. And of course, net zero, a big part of that discussion with Natural England. Relationships, influencing, and more of that in time to come. But when I talk about the different prime ministers, I do just want to set the scene on the legacy of what they have left behind, because of course Boris Johnson, it was, as you remember, Build Back Beaver. Beavers formed a big part of the Johnson-led administration. Indeed, they form a big part of policy thinking now, with landscape recovery, species reintroduction. We have a species reintroduction task force. We have an animal sentience committee, all part of the Johnson agenda. We then, luckily, don't really spend too much time on Liz Truss. It's fair to say that having worked with her in DEFRA and DIT, I was astonished at even how much worse she was as Prime Minister. She was quite remarkably bad. And more of her in a minute too, if I might. And then we've got to the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who is extremely different. But of course, the legacy, and it's why I want to start off, the legacy is there with all of them. But the challenge and the legislation of net zero has not gone away. But there are other legislated targets from the Johnson era. So, of course, all pre-pandemic, pre-war, they introduced the Office of Environmental Protection, and we have really challenging targets now on clean air, clean water, net zero, tree planting, green energy, no targets, more of that later too, on food production. But these are legislated targets for us to achieve. Most of it raised above the level of the EU. So these are extraordinary times and challenging times, and getting the policy framework right has probably never been more important. Added to which, when I took the decision to stand for a third term, I thought, well, it'll be 2 quiet years to work on ELMS and get everything right, and you know, what's not to like. And this time last year, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and everything has been blown out the water ever since. So when I look at the landscape right now, price of gas, wholesale gas, is still 2.5 times higher than it was back in 2019. In 2022, on the impact of all that cost inflation, 50% higher now, 50% higher cost inflation than it was in 2019. We produced 1 billion less eggs in 2022 to what we did in 2019. We got the lowest level of tomato production since records began. That's the same for cucumbers, that's the same for aubergines. So you see what I mean by this being a game changer. And we have that legislative pathway that we're on that is not going to stop. You know, we're not going to stop any of the legislation. And in many ways, I think, as I said at the beginning, net zero becomes the solution to all of this. But it is just worth setting the scene that this is a lot more difficult now than it ever was beforehand. And it's very easy to think, it's amazing how quickly you get bought into the new normal. If we had known the new normal that is now last year, we would have thought, well, that isn't going to work. That won't happen. We won't be able to do that. And to a certain extent, we sort of can't do that in some sectors, which is why, particularly for horticulture, the challenges are so great, because there isn't the hedging in place that other countries have got. We're not part of the ETII scheme, the government's industry intensive energy scheme. Questions to ask perhaps about why the Royal Botanical Gardens are, as important as the Royal Botanical Gardens are, they are part of the ETI. Nobody going protected crops is yet. So we start this journey with a real need and thirst to get this right. And I want to talk you through now our thinking, because it's very easy to deliver on a soundbite of, you know, well, let's beat the government target by 10 years, achieving net zero by 2040, what's not to like? But what we have tried to do at the NFU is 2 things. One, campaign, hence the million people you talked about, working with Jamie Oliver, Jeremy Clarkson and many others. By the way, it wasn't animal rights, it's animal welfare, because animal rights just do not want any of us to exist. We would be gone. So we've been campaigning on one hand, and wherever there has been a problem, we have been working up a policy solution on the other. So we employ at our headquarters 150 people. We employ staff in our London office, our Brussels office, our regional offices, all of whom are completely committed to delivering a thriving, profitable, sustainable future for British agriculture. So we have the technical staff expertise and the likes of me who are leading the organisation as active farmers ourselves, which makes us, I think, quite a winning formula. So we have worked and are still working on the iterative journey of carbon neutral food production and what that will mean. So we've been working with a farmer panel, but of course it would be very easy for farmers to come together and plan their journey for net zero, and it might look slightly different to the scientific academic journey to net zero. So with our farmer panel, we have been benchmarking ourselves effectively, continually, having our homework marked by the scientific and academic panel, who is really sense checking everything that we are saying. And of course, you know, the whole role of innovation, R&D, the new opportunities is changing at pace. So it's bringing all of that in. So I foresee it remaining a very iterative journey. Some people will never get to net zero. Some people won't want to get to net zero. But as I say, and I talked to Nuffield students yesterday, and they said, well, you know, one of them, big poultry producer, he said, well, I don't want to do it. I said, I don't see the value in it. And I said, well, it doesn't really matter whether you want to do it or not. It is legislated to do it. So my focus is making sure that you are not taxed out of existence. We have the right policies, the right incentives. Decarbonisation comes at a cost, and it very much sits with the new policy framework. So there were three parts of the thinking for us that we are working on, very much boosting productivity, storing carbon on farm, as well as capitalising on renewable energy with carbon capture. And these were identified really as the three main themes for delivery. Resource use efficiency. The trouble is, a lot of the words and the phraseology that we use, productivity, word loathed by the NGOs. The moment I mention productivity, they immediately say, oh, it's just the NFU, you just want to produce more. No, it's all about producing more and decreasing our food production footprint. So productivity, efficiency is about lightening the load on the land effectively. So you're increasing your yield, but you are farming smarter. And resource use efficiency is a big part of that. How do we make better use of our natural resources effectively, our organic manures? And we've been working very closely with Harper Adams and the Sustainability School on a whole chain approach, working with McDonald's, with Morrison's, on making better use of our organic manures, but also focusing on crop nutrients, which are expensive. We know they are extremely carbon intensive. Indeed, the biggest source of carbon in production of grain is nitrogen fertilizer. And anybody who's buying nitrogen fertilizer, I know my agronomist keeps telling me, well, it's come right down in price, only £400 a tonne. And I'm thinking, you know, as a beef farmer, £400 a tonne is still pretty much unaffordable. So the pressure is massively on. And of course, huge differences in elms on the focus of grassland versus grain. But ultimately, what we've got to do is really marry up what has always been called to date mixed farming, which is now making sure that the arable and livestock sector is effectively working and operating as one. So we've got to be maximising our crop nutrients. We've got to be focusing on the circular economy opportunity. We've really got to be refocusing, I think, completely on animal feed. Our poultry board has done a huge amount on effectively the deficit we face in protein raw materials and our total reliance to date on imported soy. Their resilience plans, they are very much looking at how we drive innovation in insect protein and broader alternatives. And of course, leaving the EU effectively leaves us with an opportunity to change how we produce our proteins. I'm reliably informed that the precision breeding bill is going to achieve royal assent any moment soon. That again will be a game changer. I think under the CAP, we very much neglected the pulse sector and the opportunity. So there is a case for modern day policy to create an environment where plant breeders and researchers can drive that investment into domestic protein crop production. And I guess even before these inflationary times, there was clearly an incentive to drive efficiency, and many businesses rightly question the ability for further growth. And this is where we need policy to support innovation and to reward public good for reducing emissions to support investment that the marketplace cannot reward. I mean, continually consumers are wanting more and more and more out of what we're producing, and they don't want to pay for it. So as I said at the beginning, it comes at a cost, and who is going to pay for it? I just want to focus briefly on renewable energy. I mean, agriculture has a huge opportunity to be a massive part of the solution here. We have some challenges, our national grid being one of them. Real challenges with the national grid. If we can really revolutionise what the grid is going to look like, we of course have, you know, you think of it, the cattle sheds out there, the poultry buildings, the grain stores, a lot of them without any solar panels on whatsoever. We know that businesses are ready to invest, but our national infrastructure is without doubt creaking right now. The electricity grid is absolutely failing to keep up with the modern realities that we are facing into. And solutions most definitely lie in local grid solutions and energy storage. Huge investment though, huge investment, and it will demand confidence. And it's where I really hope that the creation of the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero will really bring all of this into sharp focus. But broader renewable energy requires a planning framework that is sympathetic to both energy and food security needs, and particularly for small businesses. I'm really conscious of the businesses that I represent. Yeah, we represent some huge landowners, but our average member is less than 400 acres. So there's a real challenge here with the scale of production and smaller producers and what that's going to look like. We've also got enormous opportunities. I talked about how we can effectively revolutionise our waste products, resource use efficiency, but also we've got a lot of opportunity with AD. Simple things like, you know, muck source heat pumps. Again, though, planning, infrastructure, confidence to align all of these things is going to be absolutely crucial. And then briefly to touch on carbon capture and storage. A huge amount of focus of carbon storage on farm, and I would say somewhat of a wild west of a market out there that at the moment is completely unregulated. I was on a panel with a guy from Schroders the other day who was saying, when he was asked about crypto, he said, well, we see crypto as incredibly high risk. We're far more focused on the opportunities in the carbon market. Well, you know, it just does not exist right now. It is completely unregulated. It is full of snake oil salesmen. It is greenwashed, and it is extremely dangerous, we feel, to lock land in to a market that doesn't exist. We absolutely will have to be looking at what those governance principles are, and it's been a big part of the work that we have done, hoping to avoid long-standing restrictive covenants on land long after payments have ceased. So we've set out effectively 5 principles on what these new markets should look like. So very much focusing on environmental markets, working alongside domestic food production of food, energy and fibre. Public policy and government initiatives must support the development of private markets. I'm very much part of the Environmental Farmers Group where I am at home. That is a whole catchment. So we've all been working as farmer clusters, led by GWCT, the Game and Wildlife Conservancy Trust, and we have recently brought together a new trading platform across a whole catchment that will be creating and has created, I believe, a new economic model. So very much focusing on a trading platform whereby we are all, as farmers, landowners, don't forget I'm a tenant, we are all investing in this cooperative and we are all benefiting from the trades. So very much focusing on water quality, biodiversity, net gain. Don't forget these two are both legislated on, and eventually carbon credits. But we cannot just allow the current model to continue. We've got to be able to stack the future effectively. You get the food production framework right as the platform, and then you can stack these new market opportunities. Now, some people might just choose to have environmental outcomes as a crop. They might choose to farm the environment and not have anything that is focused on food production, energy or fibre whatsoever, or they might have that as one part of. The third principle is really focusing on clear rules and standards that will allow farmers and buyers to participate with confidence. Both have got to participate with confidence, and these have got to be real. It can't just be a desktop exercise. Markets should be accessible across a range of farm sizes, as I've said, tenures and business structures, so that we don't create a world of winners and losers. George Dunn here working so closely with us on the future of tenants, obviously the ROT review. This is vital that, you know, with over 50% of the farmers in England as tenants, it's got to work for both. And above all else, I guess, farmers must be fairly rewarded for the delivery of what those environmental needs are going to be. But I guess before we get on to what is exciting for many of offsetting a carbon business for the future, we also need to be considering insetting. And it's really exciting, some of the businesses that I visit. I visited the Dyson strawberry business, the, I think, only glasshouse production in the country at the moment that is producing strawberries throughout the winter period and selling them through M&S. But of course, all the energy in their glasshouse production is coming through AD. There's an absolute opportunity for insetting to be done within a business, whether that is a dairy business that then has a glasshouse business alongside it. So we are capturing and we are insetting within that business. And so much of the focus at the moment is on offsetting, and insetting is definitely going to be a massive part of the way forward. There's a complete myriad of carbon calculators out there. I mean, there's over 60. We've really road tested a lot of these calculators. There's a lot of information on NFU online as to what we think of them, but we are going to have to coalesce effectively around 2 or 3 calculators. And I just want to come on to that in a minute when I talk about ELMS, but we've got to understand the baseline of our carbon footprint, and the factors that drive it are paramount for any farming business. And I guess with these markets, it's just like financial accounting. We absolutely need to see government set standards for carbon accounting, and that will be essential if we are going to tackle the greenwashing and protect businesses who are trying to do the right thing. And that applies to both domestic and imported products. And therein lies a massive challenge with the trade deals that we are striking as well. Carbon border adjustment taxes are, I think, probably for the time being, a pipe dream for Dieter Helm, rather than actual hard reality. If we went down that road, we would have to introduce it here. We would then have to make sure the World Trade Organization was mandating this. They won't. So there are big issues with what imports are going to look like, because obviously climate change is global. We've got to take a global approach, and we can't disadvantage our farmers and growers on this journey. I guess I want to move on now to just focusing on what the state of play is with the policy framework at the moment. So I guess my big frustration with ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, is that it's got no scientific rigor at all. Co-design has very much been about selecting of farmers, some good farmers, some moderate farmers, and some probably not very good farmers at all. Now, how can you drive a new policy without that scientific rigor? You know, we've got here Reading University and everything that you offer and everything that you do. I've been very involved with Rothamsted and the work that they have done, not only here, but globally. The opportunities with NIAP that I believe can deliver a complete step change in productivity measures and precision breeding. The Wakehurst project that I've visited at Kew, again, monetizing, valuing natural capital. So very much looking at carbon sequestration in a grassland, comparing it with an ancient woodland, looking at the value of mycorrhizal fungi, valuing pollinators. 4 work streams: pollinators, hydrology, and health and well-being. Is there a value to all of us being out in the countryside? And what should the value of that look like? We all pay to go to a gym and we access the countryside completely freely. And what does the future of that look like? And so why isn't ELMS having effectively the tires kicked on the scientific rigor that should be absolutely underpinning everything that is done? Because I think there's a real danger on this journey to net zero, that if we don't have the right policies in place, we are going to get left behind. When I look at others out there, the New Zealanders, they are being taxed on their emissions. And we want to find a way through that, whereby we are very much a big part of the solution. The Prime Minister, this Prime Minister, has actually made some really important commitments on food production. He talked about creating a new target of self-sufficiency and a mandatory reporting, so a statutory underpinning of that self-sufficiency figure. Now that is really, really crucial right now, because many of you will be experiencing challenges wherever you are farming with local authorities, environmental impact assessments. I've got a planning project that has been held up for several years now with challenges around phosphates. So we've got more and more challenges in this area. And I take you back to where I started with those legislated targets. Now, if you are looking at what needs to be done and what is legislated on, you are focusing on clean water, you are focusing on clean air, you are focusing on tree planting targets, you are focusing on land out of production for nature. I promise you, no local authority, because it doesn't exist in there, will be saying, well, what about food production? Where does this sit? So it's really, really important that within the land use framework that is on its way through Parliament now, that self-sufficiency figure is set down and the annual reporting process is put in. Because what I said about eggs, you know, it is a massive issue that we have 1 billion less eggs than we did have in 2019. The medical advice is, you know, if you are old, pregnant, young, eat British Lion Mark eggs. Do not eat imported eggs. Absolutely do not eat imported eggs that are runny, for the challenges and the risks of what that might be. So we've got to get this right, and getting that whole food production built into this thinking is fundamental on this journey to net zero as well. So he's committed to that. Therese Coffey, who is more known for her desire to have us all eating turnips at the moment than she is for her commitment to food security. But when I asked her, and I said in my first meeting with her, the Prime Minister, back on the leadership campaign, made some really important commitments to food production. When will you be looking to introduce those? She said, well, that was in August. And I could say, well, yes, but now he's Prime Minister, so surely it will happen. It's fair to say DEFRA have done every single thing possible to avoid doing this. Mark Spencer said to me recently, well, we wouldn't want to do that because then we'd be fining ourselves if it slipped. I said, well, you're the government, you can design what this is going to look like, but I see it as purely a reporting. And if you were seeing slippage in some sectors, you would probably decide that you wanted to do something about it. And the situation with fresh produce, had we had a different approach, and we've just published our 10-point plan for growth in the horticultural sector, had we had a different approach whereby we'd had better engagement and holding to account from government with retailers and processors and packers, if they had done what we asked and used their own powers in the Agricultural Act, they should have had an emergency investigation into why the egg sector was slipping so badly. The reason why Europe is carrying on pretty much as normal is because they are really well hedged, so they can carry on as normal with these energy costs, and we can't. So there are many moving parts, but all roads lead back to making sure that food production fits within the policy landscape. I can't not touch on trade because, again, those 4 prime ministers have had completely different approaches to trade. Boris Johnson had a sort of randomised approach to trade, is probably the best way of describing it. His wife had enormous influence, and her friendship with Zach Goldsmith had enormous influence over what Boris Johnson might or might not do. Many of you will know George Eustace's comments now, and some of you might feel frustrated, some of you might feel good on him for speaking out. I mean, I am pleased he's spoken out, and I am pleased he's showing the Australian deal for what it is, because he believed, like we believed, that you had to have sensitive sectors in trade deals. We were always going to do a trade deal with Australia. But Australia agricultural production is completely carved out of their commitments to climate change. So those Australian farmers are not having to comply with any of the rules and regs, for example, that the New Zealand farmers are having to comply with. And so had we done a deal with New Zealand first, it would have been completely different to doing Australia second, because actually there's a lot of synergies between UK and New Zealand on animal welfare, on climate change, and we would have been able to lead much better. But no, we did Australia first and we liberalised. And I think that standards campaign that we hosted, took through, collaborated, convened, worked, dare I say it, with the Mail on Sunday to deliver it, which was actually really important to get to as many people. We got 1 million people in a month. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that we would be importing hormone-treated beef. I've heard it from so many different quarters. The Canadians right now are determined that they will get hormone-treated beef over the line, and we will be bringing it into the UK. It's a red line for government, but only because the flag has been raised so high that they would not dare do it. All of these things, our beef production will be really, really up against it, competing with these biggest players in the world. So again, that journey to net zero is the only way we remain competitive. It really is. So trade matters and CPTPP, another joyous acronym, basically the Trans-Pacific deal, which has countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, all part of, is really all about Canada and Mexico, all wanting access to our market. Now, one snippet of news that I do have, and don't be hitting social media with it, but Liz Truss would have fully liberalised on CPTPP, fully liberalised. That would have had huge, huge impact. It's not going to be a liberalised deal at all now. I'm led to believe my conversations with Number 10 at the end of last week that they will be looking at TRQs on beef as an example of 13,000 tonnes, poultry 26,000 tonnes. There will be opportunities, offensive opportunities for dairy, for milk powder, of getting our market access into Canada and into Mexico. So it looks a lot better than it did. So I guess the journey is, as I said at the beginning, it's an iterative one. And I have tried to bring all of those different things in because they will all impact on the journey. But you won't be able to remove yourself from the flight path effectively. You know, this is the road that we are on. Governments will come and go. We are proudly apolitical, so we are really trying hard to influence everyone on this journey. Keir Starmer recently spoke at our conference, and it will be really, really important that I think DEFRA becomes an economic department. You know, currently it is very much focused and divided in its ambition as to whether it is an environmental department or whether it is a food and farming department. It fundamentally needs to be an economic department. It needs to be able to focus on all of those. It needs to be able to focus on food production and delivering on the targets for nature. And actually, if it can't be an economic department, it won't do any of that. And everybody I represent is a business. These are all businesses. You will all be going on to either be running your own businesses or working within a business. But ultimately, that will be the way forward. So making sure that DEFRA does become an economic department is essential. At the moment, what do I think? I think at the moment it is absolutely focused on delivering regulation baseline effectively. You know, a new pot of money that has been committed to for the term of this Parliament, and we've got all these legislated targets, so that's where the money's going to go. That is fine as long as you make sure that the market bit is operational. You know, if you don't have that as operational, you've got enormous challenges. So I think with that, I will probably pause there and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Great. I would like to invite Richard, who will be managing the Q&A session, Professor Richard Francis. I will have a microphone, so we'll be walking around. So just raise your hands and I'll try and remember whose hand was first. Okay, priority will be given to young people. And then we have the online Q&A chat, and Simon will manage that and will address the questions directly from the chat. Okay,
so we've always had an aim to have a diverse range of questioners, and we've always had two rules for questioners. The first is none of these clever double or triple questions, single questions. And the second rule is please identify yourself. So say Jane Bloggs, dairy farmer, or John Wordsworth, agriculture student, because that would help Minette frame her answer. So, who have we got first?
I'm George Harris. I'm a second-year agriculture business management student. My question is: if the UK agriculture achieves net zero, will we still be competitive, and how will we remain competitive with other countries that aren't achieving the target of net zero, like you've previously mentioned, Australia and places like that?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge to a certain extent, and at the moment it just doesn't stack up, and I guess that was my biggest frustration with the Johnson-led government. You know, it was all about the raising of standards here above the level of European ones, and it was not giving a damn about what our imports were going to be, and that, if I'm honest, just seems wholly unfair. We've got to be able to look for a level playing field whereby we remain competitive. The Trade Agriculture Commission, which is very much an outcome of the million people, is in place. It has primary legislation that underpins it, so it will be there for a minimum of 7 years. It will do reports on every trade deal that will go to Parliament and will be in the public domain. And what they had committed to, what they have done, is to produce what the core standards should look like within these trade deals. So right now, they should be saying to Australia, these are the core standards, and that is how we want our trading relationship to work. At the moment, Australia, not that we ever will be exporting meat to Australia, because they're several 100% self-sufficient, and cost of living over there is much higher than here, but Australia doesn't even recognise our health certificates. So even if we wanted to export meat to Australia, we wouldn't. So all this line of it's a great deal, it is not a great deal. It really isn't, unless you're exporting biscuits or a few other things, then it might be, but you've got such a small population. So it is a very, very live threat, and it'll be very interesting to see what or if Labour decides to do anything about it, because they could. It would be quite high risk for relationships. But there are things that they could do. We know, for instance, that they will align on SPS rules with Europe. What does that really mean? I mean, that is food safety. Of course, you know, all parties will want to make sure that food is safe. But what will that mean for food values? So this is still yet to play out as to what trade is actually going to look like. But Australia and New Zealand will achieve royal assent this spring. We will have a live trading relationship before the end of the year. And I guess my biggest worry is retail, you know, years and years and years of us holding them to account, getting commitments on British sourcing, you know, has really kept our industry in a good place, and it's why beef prices have been holding up so well for so long. For one of the first times ever, Irish prices just jumped to above British price. But sorry to give such a long-winded answer, but when we went into COVID, into lockdown, what did we eat? We ate mince, and more mince, and more mince, and the chillers filled up and up and up with steaks and joints, and the price crashed very quickly. And that just shows how fragile carcass balance is. And it's why we wanted to make sure that carcass weight equivalence was part of the Australian trade deal. So they couldn't do what they were saying and just send us strip loins and top end cuts. So they had to send us the frozen, the bone in, they had to effectively balance the carcass themselves. All of that got ripped out, all because Boris Johnson wanted to shake hands at the G7, and Scott Morrison said, well, you're not going to do this? We won't shake hands tomorrow. Okay, right, we'll rip it all out. So nobody really knows the answer to your question yet. But what I said to number 10 last week was the road that we're on at the moment is just plain unfair. I said, you can't have, you know, the focus on elms delivering ever higher standards for the environment, ripping away direct support, which has been one way of dealing with volatility, which is why they delivered a part payment this summer, so that people could cope with the challenges of the drought and forage costs. And if we rip all of that out and say, right, you're going to go toe to toe with Australia and Canada and everyone else, it's going to have massive impact. So it's a live discussion, and the election, it will be really important for all of you to be telling your MPs, what are you going to do? Because this election is going to matter probably more than any other election, certainly in my lifetime.
Okay, next one, please. And the pink guys over there. Yeah.
Minette Mary Gayton, I'm a second year ABM student as well. So my question for you is, representing all the young people in the room tonight, because obviously we're all university students, the future of agriculture at the moment is looking pretty glum and it's quite negative. So I just wanted to ask, like, what advice can you give us that will just make us be a bit more hopeful for the future, just make us a bit more inspired to just carry on and keep pushing through?
Very good question, and you are quite right to tell me to look at the opportunities out there, and lovely to see you.
Yeah.
Look, we have, I mean, Australia doesn't have a market. The reason why Australia is so keen to access other markets is because they have such a small market at home. We have a huge market. We have one of the best markets in the world. We have 70 million people on an island. You know, what is not to like? And that is why Canada and everybody is so keen to access this market. The Canadians 6 years ago, you know, said to me when they were finalising CETA, they said, you know, it's not about the EU, it's about the UK food market. And we're here, and it's ours. So, you know, that is a massive, massive opportunity for us. We're going to have to revolutionise our focus on exports. I mean, I could pick a fight in an empty room, you know, by talking about farm assurance. You know, there are so many farmers that loathe it. It is absolutely, if we are going to have our point of difference, we have got to have an audit trail of how we've produced it. If we haven't got an audit trail, wrapping ourselves in a flag is not going to be worth anything at all. You've got to be able to show that method of production and why it is an added value market out there. So it's going to be out there. Hopefully it's not me that's making you off. And you know, when I speak to the Irish, they will say, if you're exporting, which they are, in Southern Ireland, they're exporting 90% of their beef. They say, you know, that audit trail is absolutely everything, which is why they're whole life assured, it's why they're carbon accounting, because they're always trying to look for that added value opportunity. And we will be importing a lot more. We will have to be exporting a lot more. So our whole mindset is going to have to change because we've been very insular in our thinking. We haven't collaborated. You know, half the reason we've got a challenge with the retailers that we have now is because we failed to collaborate. Most of the businesses in Europe, you know, are cooperatives and they own the food businesses. And you've only got to look at the power of Arla UK to see how they were able to go into Tesco's and say to Tesco's, you've got to move on milk price. If you don't move on milk price, we're going to be 12% bare minimum shortage of liquid milk. It was the power of the cooperative. So the picture I paint might be quite a bleak one, but it's a call to arms to say, get your act together, collaborate, buy together, sell together. Don't moan about, not that any of you are, but some people are moaning about, you know, effectively what they have to do. We're going to have to do it, and I don't want you to be taxed on it. So, you know, we've really got to make this industry work. And the four markets that we have to focus on are the out-of-home market, something that we tend to forget about completely. That's 50% of the value of the food market in this country. Now, huge strides being made with McDonald's and others in massive investment in British and Irish. They are not going to step back from that, and we need to grow it. We need to grow our market share and out-of-home. You then come on into retail. We need to keep them absolutely to wanting to buy British. And why do they want to buy British? You know, they absolutely, we have to have that USP. And then we have exports, and then we have procurement. So again, you know, Keir Starmer poaching one of Rishi Sunak's commitments on procurement, 50% of British. Government lawyers are at the moment saying, you know, well, state aid rules, I thought we'd left the EU, state aid rules are still preventing us promoting British. So that's the environment we're working with. Keir Starmer, though, has said, actually, no, we will change those rules and we will be able to have British in procurement. That's £4 billion worth of market. So the future is out there. The future will be fine. It won't be fine if we think how we did in the past. Do you see what I mean? You have got to think differently because change will either be forced on you or you drive it. And what we're trying to do is drive that positive change.
Can you identify just an online one, who they are, or?
I can. So we have 50 people online, and their questions are coming in thick and fast. But one or two of them have identified who they are, which helps, and they've also got the advantage that they can vote on whether they like the question or not. So I'm going to pick the question that's got the votes. So this is a question about elms. So this is from a tenant farmer's daughter and rural surveyor. Struggling to understand how your statement about no scientific backing for elms is the case. A lot of the options introduced this summer in SFI were drawn from, or very similar to, countryside stewardship options, which have obviously got a long pedigree with proof of benefit. So can you expand a little bit on your contention that there's no scientific backing to the elm scheme?
Well, countryside stewardship is agri-environment for a start, predominantly. What we are trying to focus on is getting a foundation whereby, you know, we are measuring where we start this journey from. So creating, if you like, an SFI farm tier of a foundation that farmers in England will want to base their businesses on. They will effectively be told, you know, these are the metrics on soil health and carbon sequestration that we want you to look for. I don't see how that is done with countryside stewardship. I think you have to be working with Wakehurst or Rothamsted or someone to look at what you would want to be measuring, and to define the calculators that you would want to be using. So, you know, we can focus on agri-environment schemes, but what we want to focus on is making sure that we develop a farm tier, a foundation that really does have scientific rigor built into it. I think whether it's the RSPB or ourselves, everybody would say that co-design has not done what it should have done. And the selection of farmers to be building what those pilots are going to look like, what the outcomes of the pilots are going to look like, we don't know who those farmers are. Is that really a credible way to build a new policy? I mean, I would want the best scientists that we have to be looking at this, because it's there. You know, if you look at crop insurance in the US, I mean, Rothamsted have got all the methodology on that. You know, it isn't just a sort of finger in the air and see what it looks like. You don't get any crop insurance unless you have had your focus on your soil health. And I don't see how we would ever be any different. And I think the real danger is that, you know, when we are next round of funding, parliamentary cycles, when the Permanent Secretary and the Secretary of State have to put their plan forward up against the NHS, up against education, and the benefits are looked at, what benefits will they be? I mean, you know, we are at the moment funding, nothing against beavers, but is it really best use of taxpayers' money to be building beaver enclosures? Is that really the best use? I'm not sure that it is. Nothing wrong with having a beaver enclosure or a beaver, but probably private money should be paying for that beaver enclosure. And I don't know that when you've got a cost of living crisis, you've got people going to food banks, it really will be justifiable to have that as a policy focus. I think we've got to deliver a multifaceted return for any public investment. And actually the best investment of any public monies at the moment are to the subject title, the journey to carbon neutral food production.
Next, in the middle, yeah.
Good evening. Tom White, former credit student, and currently run a tenant sheep and calf business. If your business can go better than net zero and actually provide benefit to the environment, who owns that benefit? Is it the farmer, the landowner, the processor, or the supermarket? And how do you stop that the environmental benefit being paid 4 times by all different businesses?
Yeah, well, until we get the finance and accounting approach effectively to the carbon market, that is the highest risk. I think we absolutely have to focus on getting scope 1 and 2 done. You know, effectively the industry has got to get its own house in order before it starts selling off the crown jewels. There also has to be a separate value to the farmer for scope 3 emissions. You know, I see a lot upstream who are very much looking to merge everything together. Well, there's got to be a separate value to scope 3 when we are coming back to the farm gate. But if we don't know where we start from, back to the scientific rigor and the baseline, we don't know where we start this journey from. How on earth can we measure it? You know, everything starts with that one measurement point. I mean, I would want almost nothing else in the SFI other than to get the farm tier right and have farmers in England wanting to jump on that platform and say, yeah, I want to be on this platform and this is what we're going to focus on. And actually, if you incentivize that, you could then have them scaling the ladders. So your ladder that you would choose to scale might be very different to other people in this room. They would potentially be going up different ladders depending on where they are farming and what sector they are in. But if you don't start on the same platform, you're going to be climbing unlevel ladders effectively. And there's real dangers that the supply chain will continue to want more on its sustainability goals. It will continue to ask you for more. And where will the market return be for all that? You know, so there are many things that need to come together to make sure that the value remains there. But I just don't think we can afford to stand still. I think we've really got to go with what the market wants. And what we haven't touched on and what has got a big role to play in all of this is effectively fairness in the supply chain and transparency in the supply chain. The dairy contracts work is now getting speeded up as the election fever starts to hit. Mark Spencer is very keen now to get the dairy contracts work over the line and done and dusted. And that will be a blueprint for pigs, for poultry, and it will mean that effectively we have fair terms of reference, cost of production effectively, for making sure that we are getting fair return back to the farm gate. At the moment, there's no transparency. Voluntary codes never did work, they won't work. So that will have to be a statutory approach to that. So there's probably a whole multitude of things that will need to come together to make sure that you are not disadvantaged and you are getting the return that you should be.
Another one in the room. At the back there. 3 rows from the back, 2 in. Yeah.
Hi Minette, I'm Carol Wagstaff. I'm Research Dean here at university with the Agriculture, Food and Health remit. It's a fascinating remit, but it does produce its tensions. So on one hand, I see farmers who aren't getting a fair return and a fair price for the food they produce. I see a food industry who wants to be part of the solution and not regarded as part of the problem. And on the health side of things, I see people that can't afford to eat a healthy diet. They can't afford the price of food as it is now. How do we get to the point where people can afford to make the right choice, to buy British, to stop themselves getting all of these diseases, to not be consigned to food banks and eating end-of-life poor quality food, but still give the farmers a fair price for what they produce? What is that journey?
So, Carol, there's a real danger that I'm telling my grandmother how to suck eggs effectively here in all of this. But I mean, it's well documented, it's well known that people on the lowest incomes are spending more on their food than anyone else. So most people are spending less than 10% of their earned income on food. We know in poorer households, and in many cases it's 18, 19, 20%. It just goes up because processed food is extremely expensive. And processed food, really, therein lies the challenge for what society is facing at the moment. I think there's real live dangers in this area, because certainly this government, or the different manifestations of what a conservative approach has meant, has been very much about, you know, wealthy people can have high quality British food that's sort of up here, sort of farm shop Britain, and poor people effectively can have cheap imports. Now, I think the 2-tier food system in this country is absolutely disastrous, and we should fight it to the bitter end, because what we have at the moment is the most affordable food in the world, the most affordable in Europe. If you want to buy a pepper in Holland, it will cost you 3 times as much as it will here. So they don't have the food waste issues that we have. And it's a real danger, especially for someone like me, to say, oh, food prices need to rise and we won't waste as much. I don't think it's anywhere near as simple as that. But I think our culture around food, around our inability to cook from scratch, has been a massive issue. And it's quite interesting with Labour again, Rachel Reeves, as the Shadow Chancellor, is passionate about this subject and wants food back on the curriculum and wants cooking for primary school children back on the curriculum. And as someone who trained as a chef and has been adamant that my children, against their better judgment, I might add, learn to cook, I think it is totally fundamental to a healthy diet. You will never enjoy your food or appreciate your food if you don't understand how to cook it, and it will save you a fortune if you can cook it from scratch. But you know, that is the live danger, that we go into a two-tier food system that really is shark-infested waters, and that won't really happen in retail. It will happen in the out-of-home market. So when you go out to your pubs, your hotels, your restaurants, they can say whatever they want to say. They can say it's sourced 10 miles down the road from Reading, and you won't know. You won't know where the hell it's come from. It could have come straight out of South America, straight out of Australia, and you won't know. And that's where the real risk lies. And the risk of a food scare right now, extremely high. You know, if you speak to the FSA, you know, we are importing a lot of food that we are not checking at the moment. And without implementing the core standards on these trade deals, you know, we're going to have Australian produce on our marketplace, and New Zealand produce on our marketplace. So it feels like quite a high risk time for consumers in this country.
Minette, can you manage 2 more questions?
I certainly can.
So we have one online, Simon. Yep. And one in the room.
I get to choose as we're rushing to one. So this, I'm afraid, is from Anonymous. But you mentioned opportunities around renewable energies. So the question is, what's the NFU's view on anaerobic digestion from virgin material, for example, maize, which is being promoted by some as an opportunity for farmers to capitalise on apparent green energy opportunities? Lots of planning applications around the country for such plants with overseas investment behind them. So what's the NFU view on crops for energy?
Another thorny issue. I mean, fundamentally, we don't tell our members how to farm, because you can imagine as a membership organisation, it would be enormously contentious if you did. So renewable energy in general is challenging. I mean, I've got more emails on solar and issues around landowners taking land back in hand from tenants for solar, and that is extremely divisive. So fundamentally for us, AD is about waste rather than crops, but there are many that have built a business that is reliant on a crop. So I think it's contentious, but I think it is ultimately about making sure that energy policy and food policy are aligned. And at the moment, government is taking energy policy seriously. It is not doing anything about food policy. Now, if we can align them both, you will get the outcomes that you want. And actually, renewable generation on farm really can be transformative for local communities. At the moment, it's not, and it doesn't work. And so it's no surprise that energy on farm isn't working as well.
Okay, one more in the room over there. 4 rows from the back with the white blouse on.
Hi, it's Hannah. I'm from the Masters by Research course here at Reading, Agriculture, Ecology and Environment. But my background is in macroeconomic risk modelling. So you briefly mentioned carbon markets and biodiversity net gain, and I think this follows on from the question we just had. Should we be safeguarding agricultural land use and agricultural land function when we expose this land to carbon markets, biodiversity net gain markets and energy markets?
Most definitely, and it's why I made the point about what the Prime Minister suggested back in the summer being so important. Because if we don't have food production in there and we are not making sure that our levels of self-sufficiency is a metric, it doesn't really matter whether you're exporting it or consuming it here, it's a metric of success. In broad terms, we've been sort of 60% self-sufficient for 2 decades. In many areas, we need to be producing much more. Horticulture in particular, we need to be producing much more of our field veg, much more of our protected crop sector, much more of our top fruit sector. So you've absolutely got to have that in there. I think it's a real concern for me at the moment that there is huge chunks of the land that is being bought up for planting trees, for either offsetting conscience with celebrities, or people are seeing market opportunity, and you know, with the tax incentives as well of land ownership, we're seeing a whole new market appear that just doesn't exist. So I think it absolutely has to be. Otherwise, potentially, it's part of the Oxford Farming Conference 18 months ago. That was very much focusing on what happens when the value of carbon exceeds the value of food. And where will we be producing our food going forwards? That the balance now, and it's where, and I mentioned it in my conference speech 2 weeks ago, of Professor Beddington. It was extraordinary to me that actually the perfect storm report that he produced, 2030, the perfect storm of effectively food security, energy security, climate change, water security, all colliding as one, and providing this perfect storm. Well, I mean, John must be feeling absolutely chuffed right now, because he will, I know, be saying, I told you, I told you, I told you, and you wouldn't listen, you put my report on the shelf, and now, and actually had we listened to people then, we would not be in the mess that we are in now. So it'll be very, very interesting to see what the new Chief Scientific Advisor does, and whether food security is now going to be a national priority, because honestly, whether it is ministers, whether it is officials, I have lost track of the number of people when I have challenged them who will literally say, Minette, government couldn't care less about food produced on our land. That will be the line they all say. And I cannot believe that is the line they are thinking now, because the challenges going forwards of salad shortages, we are the market at the moment of last resort in Europe. Because what I said about peppers, why would you want to sell, if you are producing in Europe, why would you want to sell into this marketplace? Because it's really, really tough. So, unless that is brought into policy thinking, there is a danger that we produce less. But I think it's changing, but it hasn't happened yet. And ultimately, they will need to walk the walk. It's been talked about. Henry Dimbleby talked about it in his food strategy. That got shelved. To the question here, to Carol's point, Henry made a big mistake. I was part of his advisory board. The rabbit hole he shouldn't have gone down was food poverty, because food poverty is a social issue, and you can't resolve a food poverty issue with a food strategy. You've got to deal with that as a social issue. So we missed out effectively on that food strategy work, all the work that he'd done, because DEFRA, again, all these reports that are written, DEFRA put it on the shelf. So they are now bringing together their own food strategy as to what that could look like.
Thank you, Minette. And before I hand over to Simon to give a formal vote of thanks, I'd like to thank you as an agricultural economist, and a diminishing number of them both here at this university and in the UK. You've identified a whole load of topics for agricultural economists to get on and do. So thank you very much. And let me hand over to Simon. Thank you.
I hope you've all had an enjoyable and informative evening. I found it incredibly thought-provoking to hear Minette speak, and to hear what questions came to mind afterwards. So I'd personally like to thank Minette for delivering the lecture and for generously answering those questions. I'm sure her schedule is incredibly packed, so it's very good that you've taken time to travel to Reading tonight to address us in person. I've also got a few other thank yous to make. So firstly, thank you all of you for attending. What you can't see is the 50 or so people online. So those online, thank you for taking time to log on. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions. Secondly, thank you to Richard for chairing the questions, and also to Teresa, who is floating around at the back. Maybe she's outside, but Teresa Hicks has been immensely valuable in organising the event behind the scenes, as had Mohammed, who is around somewhere as well, making sure that our IT and our live streaming worked effectively. So thank you, Mohammed. Finally, a number of students have helped behind the scenes and during the event, so thank you to those, and to all of the students who've turned up tonight. So I hope you've had an enjoyable evening. Let's just close by showing our appreciation to Minette for the time.